good morning or good evening from wherever you are, and welcome to day 3 of Paraguay Speaks 2021. I am Vanessa Crico, a member of the Paraguayan Student Association at the University of Melbourne. Before we begin, I would like to start by showing my respect and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land of elders past, present, and emerging, on which this meeting is taking place. For those who are just joining us, welcome. I know many of you may still be hooked on after Andrew's exciting conference. So may I remind you that this event is being recorded and you may revisit it through our YouTube channel. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag PYSpeaks2021. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to your host for today, Gregory Ross. Greg is a master's student at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where he studies Latin American political economy with a focus on the countries of the Southern Cone. In 2019, he conducted research in Paraguay about 19th century trade and migration on the Rio Paraguay, and previously wrote his bachelor history thesis on urban planning in Paraguay under José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia. Believe it or not, he's 25% Paraguayan, and his grandfather was born and raised in Asunción. Greg will be monitoring questions and comments from our audience today, so I would like to encourage everyone here to use the Q&A function on Zoom throughout this conference. Questions and comments in Spanish are also welcomed. Thank you, Greg, for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of such an exciting conference series. So thank you to the Paraguayan Student Association and the Paraguay Speaks team. And it's especially great to see how this series has brought together so many interesting people and experts from so many parts of the world to talk about Paraguay. So one of those experts is our speaker for this session, who will be telling us about his project, the Hummingbirds Atlas, mapping Guaraní history between 1500 and 1820. That expert is Freg J. Stokes, who is a writer, performer, and map maker from Melbourne, Australia. He is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Melbourne, and his doctoral thesis provides part of the research basis for the Hummingbirds Atlas. He has also worked on applied theater and public art projects in Australia, Brazil, and Bhutan. So before I pass the microphone to our speaker, I'd like to remind everyone once again in the audience that we'll have a space of about 15 minutes after the presentation to ask questions. So please write down any questions you have during the presentation. Feel free to send those via the chat feature during the event, so we can get right to as many questions as possible after the presentation. So without further ado, I'll ask our speaker, Freg, to take the main stage and show us your exciting project.
Thanks very much, Greg, from Greg to Freg. I'd also like to, as Vanessa has, acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, at least in my case, in West Melbourne, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And that's important in a project like this as well, which is about Indigenous history in Paraguay and in South America more broadly. While I speak, I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint, so I'll just bring that up now. I think, Vanessa, I'm going to have to be made a host again so that I can share the screen. Just play some elevator music while we resolve this technical difficulty. But while we wait, I'll just talk a little bit more about the project. The Hummingbirds Atlas comes from my PhD research and has been a project 5 years in the making. I've been moving between Australia and South America while working on this project and collaborating with various Guaraní writers and documentary makers to explore Guaraní history, particularly in the first 3 centuries after the initial Spanish invasion, as a historical and archival basis to inform current indigenous land struggles in Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Okay, so I can share the screen now. So I'll just check that up. So the research objective of this project has been to map Guaraní history in the Atlantic rainforest during the emergence of capitalism, particularly during that period from 1500 to the 1800s. So when I talk about the Atlantic rainforest, I'm talking about this rainforest which runs along the eastern coast of South America between northeast Brazil and Paraguay. That's completely separate from the Amazon rainforest, which is in northern Brazil and also in neighboring countries. The Atlantic rainforest at the point of initial colonization in an invasion around 1492, 1500, was about 1/5 of the size of the Amazon rainforest. So it's a very significant biome in its own right as well. And then the outcome after the thesis, the plan is to make a Guaraní historical atlas documenting this history. So that'll be in collaboration with those other writers and filmmakers in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. So there are different frameworks informing this work: Guaraní history and cosmology, so Guaraní points of view. Also different insights from South American anthropology, and from different forms of historical sociology and history that analyze the origins of capitalism. So world systems analysis, world ecology, uneven and combined development, and also because maps and charts are such a significant part of the project, critical cartography. So critically investigating the history of mapping as well, because mapping obviously is a very important part of the process of colonization in itself. So how can maps be used to also look back on that process in a different way? So some of the Guaraní collaborators on the project, Sandra Benitez, who is an anthropologist and museum curator in Brazil. Vera Alexandre, you can see there filming, he's a documentary maker. And Timocho Popigua, who is a writer who has engaged with Leon Cadogan's work, as Andrew mentioned in the previous text, and developed his own writing on Guaraní history and cosmology. So I've been in conversation with all of these collaborators about the different research material that has come up, and along with other non-Guaraní collaborators, such as the Brazilian artist Anita Ekman. So I'm just going to show some of the material here which informs the project. So I've been visiting different archives in Europe and South America and looking at the old maps and letters and government documents discussing that history during these early periods. So that's old letters from the Jesuits and the Jesuit archive in Rome, and then national archives in Portugal, Spain, and also Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. The analysis of the Guaraní population over time is fraught with uncertainty and has many challenges because of the difficulties of knowing those early populations and what the numbers, and also the fact that all the different Spanish and Portuguese attempts to quantify indigenous populations were always part of these projects of conquering the land, of using indigenous labour in different ways. But in general, with the previous research and the research that I've done as well, the indications suggest that there was a population of over 1 million Guarani speakers, people who were speakers of the Guarani language, in the Atlantic rainforest and surrounding riverways in 1500. And then that population has diminished over time. But then recently, in the last, really just in the last 70 years, there's been a recovery of the population of people who identify as Indigenous and Guarani. So that's different from the broader Paraguayan population in particular, where there are a lot of people who speak Guarani but don't identify as Indigenous. And that's as a result of some of these historical processes as well. So if we start off looking at this history, it's really important to remember the biome that much of it is taking place in, the Southern Atlantic rainforest. And with this first map, we'll start off with the sort of easier level where we have the borders of the current countries. So that's a bit more familiar. We've got Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay and Brazil there. And then those significant cities like Asunción, Sao Paulo, Rio, Buenos Aires. And the Atlantic rainforest is in the middle of that region. So all of those borders cut through the Atlantic rainforest. Then if we get in a bit more specific about the Atlantic rainforest and start dividing that up into different bioregions, there are quite significant different areas. Outside of the rainforest, there's the Pampas, the open grasslands to the south, the Chaco, which is a mix of open forest and plains to the west, and then the Cerrado, which is a savanna in Brazil. And then within the forest, there's these different regions. There's a very important region for Umbia Guarani people, such as Timocho, which is Uvu Mbete, which is for them the center of the world. So that region is generally described as the eastern part of Paraguay, and for Timocho that includes the Iguazu waterfalls on the Argentinian and Brazilian side of the border. And that's within the Upper Paraná Atlantic Forest, which is a bioregion within the broader Atlantic rainforest. And to the east of that, there's Araucaria Forest, which are these highland pine forests. Within the rainforest, we also have to remember all the river systems, because that's so important to that history, and all the major waterfalls. So you've got the Paraná River, the Uruguay River, the Paraguay River, and then a significant set of waterfalls along the border between the plateau in Brazil, falling away into the Rio de la Plata Valley and plains. So two of those waterfalls, the Iguazu and Mocona, are still here, and two others, Guaira and Jacireta, which was more of a set of rapids, have now been destroyed by hydroelectric projects. So if we look at the Guarani population in 1500, it's a population of around 1 million or more. And this map shows Guarani population density within that region, within the rainforests and those surrounding riverways. This is the conclusion that I've come to based on that archival research and previous investigations as well, that the population was concentrated along the riverways and along the coast. And the interesting thing here is that Guarani now, the Guarani language and Guarani indigenous groups are associated with Paraguay, but at the point of colonization, they were living along the Brazilian coast as well, right up to Sao Paulo, and they still are now as well. So there's been a continuous circulation throughout the rainforest, not just within Paraguay, but within Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay as well, and Bolivia, but that's another story. I'll be focusing on these regions. So at the point of colonization as well, the Guarani network which existed throughout these regions stretched from the Andes from that Bolivian region all the way through to the Atlantic coast. And that's not something that is discussed much now, but if you look at those early historical documents and the archaeological record, what emerges is this incredible silver distribution network, silver coming down from the Andes and being moved all the way through Paraguay and transported to the coast. And the people doing that transportation were, for the most part, were Guaraní women, because there was a gendered division of labor between men and women doing more farming and transportation work, and men generally in the role of warriors and also hunting, but with some variations within that as well. That wasn't set in stone, but that's the general tendency. So when we're looking at these circulation networks, we have to remember as well that that's being carried out by women. And this whole region where you've got all these Guarani speaking groups exchanging these different metals, precious stones, and other goods, it's not controlled by any one state. It's one of the famous things about the pre-invasion Guarani societies, that it's a stateless society. So women's production of manioc and corn and beans and other really productive agricultural crops allows for high populations, but at the same time, there's incredible mobility and conflict between groups, which means that you've got this anarchic network running across this very large area where there is conflict, and any particular leader trying to accrue power, their followers can split away and form new communities and avoid centralized power. So that's driving this complex network. So then the area of interest for me in my thesis is what happened when this pre-existing indigenous network came into contact with Spanish and Portuguese colonization, remembering as well that there's all these other indigenous groups living within this region as well and interacting with Guarani groups. The groups on the Chaco, the Jay speaking groups within the forest as well, are now known as the Kanganglian, Xokleng and other groups. But the thesis focuses on the Guarani aspect of that history. So that's what I'll be looking at next. So then you have this clash with the Spanish and the Portuguese, who at this point have decided to split the world in two between them with the help of the Pope. So they've signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, 2 years after Columbus has discovered the Americas. And that draws a line which cuts the world in two like an orange, and they get one half each. And that line goes straight through the Atlantic rainforest, dividing the eastern outcrop of Brazil, which goes to Portugal, and the rest of the Americas, which goes to Spain. I hope this might be a bit tricky for those of you watching on mobile phones. So hopefully a few people have got their computer screens open. But this map shows South America in that first century of colonization. The dotted lines are the different interpretations of the Treaty of Tordesillas. The thing about that treaty was that the Spanish and Portuguese interpreted it differently. The purple region in South America shows known areas where Guarani people circulated at that time. And then these grey and green arrows show all the resources, or some of the resources, that the Spanish and Portuguese were extracting from the continent. So two of the principal resources at this time, two of the principal commodities were sugar, being produced in sugar plantations in Brazil, and then silver coming from the Andes and the former Incan Empire, which the Spanish had conquered. So that split is very important. And the silver coming through from the Andes went to Europe and circulated from Seville to the banks in Genoa to Antwerp, which was the major trading and commercial center. And then sugar from Brazil went to Antwerp as well. And at this point, this early point, much of the labor on the sugar plantations is being done by indigenous people, Guarani and Tupi people, Tupi were are closely related people to the Guaraní, who are predominantly in Brazil. So with those resources flowing into Europe, we can see that as the start of the development of capitalism. All of that accumulation of resources leads to enrichment, particularly of Antwerp and then the Netherlands afterwards, and as well as those genuine bankers, as that financial and economic system is set up within Europe. But what interests me here is how that silver route ended up flowing northwards and why it didn't go through Paraguay. Because when we look at Paraguay within the Spanish Empire, it's always talked about as this isolated region of the empire, as this region that was just on the edges, geographically irrelevant. But that doesn't quite hold up when you start looking in a bit more detail about what was going on. Because you certainly have your main mining region in the Incan Empire, and to a lesser extent in Chile, with indigenous workers there. But then what's happening is that there's these different routes with the silver flowing out of that mining region from Peru officially, and then also a clandestine secret route flowing out through Buenos Aires. But both those routes bypass Paraguay, and Paraguay is left marginalized within that system. And my argument is that marginalization comes about in part as a result of indigenous resistance, in this case, Guaraní resistance. So Guaraní groups resist the Spanish invasion, and because of that, they managed to block these silver routes. So at the same time as you've got Pizarro coming down into the Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu from the north, you've got Cabot and Demoga, these two other early colonists attempting to invade Guaraní regions to reach the Inca Empire as well, but they don't make it. They get blocked by Guaraní resistance and they get ejected. So they fail to set up a silver route that passes through the Guaraní regions. And you have various expeditions like that all fail at this early point. So you have these proposed silver routes that could run through Paraguay and make Paraguay this very important economic sector of the Spanish Empire, a trade route which could energize other commodity frontiers there as well. But that doesn't happen because of indigenous resistance. And you can see that very clearly in this map, where you have this network that already exists of Guaraní silver distribution following all those purple lines, running from the Andes to the Atlantic coast, run by those indigenous women. So there's this whole trade network and distribution network that exists already, running according to this completely different logic. But what ends up happening with the Spanish is, because they can't take over that network, they have to set up this alternative clandestine silver route, which completely bypasses Paraguay. So you can see the simplest route there would just be to go from Potosi to Sao Paulo, straight through the Guaraní territory. But that doesn't happen. Instead, they go to the south and then go up along the coast to Sao Paulo. And that's a trade route run by Portuguese merchants in Brazil who are illegally sneaking silver out of the Andes via a backdoor route. And the benefits of that illegal trade go to Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo and Rio, all these cities which then become large and significant later on, and they don't go to that Paraguayan region. So that hinders the colonization in that region. These are two pretty full-on maps here, but this is showing different Guaraní resistance to colonization during that first century. So different stages, but I've done a close-up map of the Paraguay region and Misiones, Argentina, and then also a broader map. So that broader network of resistance can be seen. So the Spanish do come in, they do set up certain cities in the Guaraní regions, but they don't manage to take it over in the same way. And because of that constant resistance, they can't stabilize themselves, they can't set up these trade routes, and the trade routes get set up in other areas instead. And then this map just shows the same thing. You've got, from Asuncion, you've got this frenetic attempt to set up all these different cities. Corrientes, they set up Santa Fe, and they set up Buenos Aires again as well after it's destroyed once. And they try and set up all these trade routes, but Guarani flight, Guarani groups dancing away from the state, avoiding the state, and Guarani groups directly resisting the state, basically impede that project and create this curious geographical detour, completely avoiding Paraguay. And so by 1600, you have this situation where you've got these silver networks flowing all around the world by this stage, right across to the Philippines and Asia as well, where silver is being traded over there. And then slaves are being captured in Africa and transported across to the Americas as well. But Paraguay is left isolated from this process, whereas the Brazilian coast is integrated into this violent system where you start having transatlantic slavery occurring and the profits of the sugar trade heading over to Europe. So it's at this point, after there's already been 80 years of resistance and conflict, that the Jesuit missions emerge, and that the Jesuit missionaries start working with different Guarani groups. So certain Guarani leaders at this point decide to ally with the Jesuits to resist attacks from Spanish and Portuguese colonists. But there are plenty of other Guarani spiritual leaders in particular who resist the Jesuits, arguing that the Jesuit missions are another form of colonization that will take them out of the forest and that will destroy their existing cosmology. And that's what a lot of existing Guarani writers argue today as well, that there was just this ongoing resistance against that process as well. At the same time as the missions in the 1600s, there was an escalation of the attacks from slave raiders from the Portuguese colonies from Brazil. And they wanted to take as many Guarani farmers in particular, so women who were agriculturalists with agricultural knowledge, to grow wheat and manioc and corn in the Sao Paulo region to supply their other colonial projects. So that's where the bandeiras come from, which in Brazilian history is this famous moment where you have these slave raids expanding out and attacking indigenous groups all over the Atlantic rainforest. This map shows that process, just focusing more on the bandeiras than the indigenous response. So all those red areas are different Jesuit missions getting attacked. The yellow lines are all the separate bandeiras, the slave raids. Bandeira itself means it's a flag bearer. So it's this idea of these sort of flags coming out with each slave raid. But they weren't to occupy territory, they were to capture indigenous labor. And then with that indigenous labor, concentrate them in Sao Paulo and use them to produce these agricultural products. So this is a more conventional map showing those raids. And then the next map I'm going to show some of the indigenous response. So once you start putting in that indigenous response, you start seeing the history as a bit more dialectical, and there's more of this clash where there's also resistance going on that affects the actions of the colonizing groups as well. The other thing to remember is that the Bandeira raiders themselves are, back up. The Bandeira raiders have thousands of indigenous troops in those groups as well. So this is a conflict mostly happening between indigenous people, but with the profits going to these European colonists. So as a response to those raids, you've got fight back. The Jesuit missions organize a military response and block the raids from expanding, as do autonomous indigenous groups, which often gets left out. And that stops the raids from advancing beyond this particular point. So the borders between Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina that we see today come about in part because of this indigenous resistance to those raids. The raids probably capture over 100,000 Guaraní people, with many of them dying of diseases or shortly after capture from violence, and many of them then going to Sao Paulo and the surrounding regions to work. These charts show population levels. Again, as I said, it's difficult to quantify exactly, but given the general evidence, it would seem that there was hundreds of thousands of people involved, Guarani people involved in the initial encomienda system in Paraguay, which was a particular way of organizing indigenous labor. And then tens of thousands subsequently on the Jesuit missions and within the Sao Paulo area as well. And this chart also shows different epidemics and diseases that affected those populations: smallpox, measles, influenza, dysentery, that appear in the records. And then this map shows those same populations, but shows all the different resistance going on, all the different battles that were occurring, both to resist the slave raiders from Portugal and also against the Spanish colonists and against the Jesuit missionaries. So there's constant warfare and resistance going on throughout the 1600s. The consequences, the global consequences of this new round of accumulation and attack on Indigenous people and the use of their labour and their knowledge is the consolidation of the transatlantic slave trade, the export of wheat to Sao Paulo, to armies attacking different ports in Africa in conflicts between the Dutch and the Portuguese and so on. So the Portuguese at this point are strengthened by that use of Guarani labour. So after that whole process, this situation arises where even in the 1700s, you have the Guarani language and variations thereof predominating in this whole region of South America, more so still than Portuguese or Spanish, even after 200 years of colonization, on the Jesuit missions and in the region around Asunción, which is still run by the Spanish colonists. You have Jesuit and Paraguayan Guarani prevailing, from which contemporary Paraguayan Guarani is descended. Then you have the Cainga groups, which just means people of the forest in Guarani. And that's the purple in the middle of the map, who are remaining autonomous from colonization and still speaking Guarani as well. And then also Língua Geral Paulista, which is a variant of Old Tupi with Guarani influence, which all those Guarani groups who were captured as slaves by the Portuguese are speaking within Brazil, in pink there. The next really significant use of Guarani labour that occurs is with the gold trade in Brazil. And this is a really important historical event on a global scale. The Guarani groups in Sao Paulo, who are called Carijós, and also include other indigenous groups, formed the vanguard for exploration of gold in Brazil. And that gold is one of the most massive gold discoveries in the world, the biggest of the 18th century, producing 40 to 80% of global gold supplies at that time. And that gold flows to England. And there's quite a few different historians who have looked at that and argued that the flow of that gold at that time helps England set up its economy in the 18th century with the Bank of England, allows it to switch over to a gold standard, and sets up the basis, along with a variety of other factors, for the later industrial revolution and that next stage of capitalist development. So that labour of indigenous people and also of African people transported as slaves to the gold fields is crucial in the development of English industrial capitalism. At the same time, on the other side of the continent, you've got yerba mate flowing from Paraguay to other parts of the Spanish Empire and being used as a stimulant for workers in the silver mines in the Andes. And that's where it gets the name mate from. It's a Quechua word from the Andes. It's not a Guarani word. The Guarani name is ka'a or ka'amiri. So it's an important stimulant for workers on another frontier producing another commodity, silver, for the global economy. But the difference between gold and yerba mate is that yerba mate is produced in the forest. The trees have to grow in the forest at that stage because the colonists can't work out a way of growing them outside of the forest in plantations. And then different Guarani groups resist the extraction of that tree as well. So around this stage in the 1700s, you get a division of that territory with the Treaty of Madrid between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and that damages the Jesuit missions, which were acting as a break on that English and Portuguese expansion in Brazil. And you see the eventual demise of the Jesuit missions. But what continues at the same time is autonomous Guarani resistance in the forest to the extraction of yerba mate. This map here is from a Jesuit missionary, Martin Dobrishofer, and it's a map of the forest and his attempts to convert these different indigenous groups in the forest. And it's also a map of an area where the yerba mate trade and extraction was occurring at that point. So I've done another version of this map, which is this map here, to give an idea of what that map is showing. And all those orange lines are these attempts to extract yerba mate from the forest, from these yerbales, the places where the yerba mate trees grow. And then all the purple numbers are different examples of Guarani groups living independently in the forest, resisting those invasions and burning the yerba mate that those people tried to take out. And then the red is the different Jesuit missions involved in there as well. So if we look at those primary commodity frontiers over the long term, those different products which were exported to Europe, you've got sugar at the start, then gold, later on coffee in Brazil, and nowadays it's soy. And this map shows the quantity of those products exported over time. This is a little bit complicated, and I think we're getting to the end, so I won't be able to go into that in detail. But this map shows the process by which those different commodities flowed and benefited first Spanish and Portuguese and later English profit making. So then the general effect of this whole process was that with that Guarani resistance in the inland parts of the forest and that use of Guarani labor on the Brazilian coast, deforestation in the Atlantic rainforest follows a particular path. Where that resistance is more successful, it impedes it for longer. And then where the exploitation occurs more successfully early on, you have deforestation occurring more rapidly. So basically you get on the sugar plantations on the coast and then the gold fields, you have deforestation occurring earlier, and then it expands inland. So in Paraguay, you still have these massive rainforests existing well into the 20th century, I argue in part because of that indigenous Guarani resistance. And it's only since the 1970s that a lot of that rainforest has been destroyed. And what's destroying it now is this latest round of production of soy and so on. So if we look at the New Australia colony, which Andrew mentioned before, what part of that project was to come into the western edges of the rainforest and establish European colonists there and displace Guarani people. There's a documentation of Guarani groups literally being kicked off that land as the colonists came in. And so then as Andrew said as well, the story of Leon Cadogan is quite inspiring in that he rejected the premises of that colony and actually started working with Guaraní people in that area rather than trying to dispossess them of their land. And then the contemporary situation we have is the ongoing deforestation, particularly in Paraguay now, for soy production. And a current state of affairs where the Paraguayan, Brazilian and Argentinian governments continue to promote those agribusiness interests over Indigenous and environmental rights, and an ongoing campaign by Guaraní groups and other Indigenous groups to protect the remaining areas of the rainforest and their land rights. And I'll end it there.
Great, thanks so much, Freg, for that engaging presentation. I was really struck by the way your maps really bring a dynamic movement to so many movements of people, different types of people, commodity flows, the movement of silver, yerba mate, and the way that maps can really bring that history to life that I think maybe other sources can't as easily do. So it was really fascinating. Now we have a couple questions already from the audience. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature and we'll get to as many as possible. First off, we have a question that says, can you say something about the commonalities and differences between Inca Vilcabamba and the Guarani Autonomous Region?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a very interesting question. And in that middle set of maps, I am exploring that question. The basic difference there, Vilcabamba is the Inca state that continues to exist after the initial conquest of the Inca Empire. So the Spanish invade the Inca Empire in the 1530s. They take most of it over, but a small remaining state continues in Vilcabamba until 1572, when it too is defeated and the Inca Emperor Tupac Amaru is executed by the Spanish. My argument is that during that same period, and then subsequently, more autonomous Guarani groups managed to continue their resistance to Spanish colonization because they don't have an existing state structure. The existing state structure of the Incas means that the Spanish recognize that structure, take over its hierarchies to exploit that population themselves, whereas they find that a lot more difficult with the Guarani populations. They try and take them over to make use of their agricultural knowledge and so on, but it's more challenging for them, and a lot of Guarani groups escape that conquest. So with the Incas and that empire, there's very assertive resistance that continues with Vilcabamba, but it's eventually defeated. And then the less hierarchical structure of Guarani resistance and the more decentralized allows them to continue their resistance in that form. And then the type of resistance within Peru changes.
I'll move on to the next question here. I've heard the common narrative that the encomienda system was actually oppressive for the indigenous, but this has always come from Spanish sources criticizing the Jesuits as part of a smearing campaign. How true is this statement? Isn't it closer to reality to say that the Jesuits were trying to defend them against massive exploitation?
Thanks, Isadora. Yeah, there's two things to bear in mind here with the encomienda system and the Jesuits, is that they're effectively two different systems. So in the maps, I represent the encomienda system in orange, and then the Spanish Jesuit missions in red. I didn't go into full details about those different systems. There were also Portuguese Jesuit missions, but they weren't as significant, and they weren't as many indigenous people involved in them, and they were more closely allied with the Portuguese colonists. In the Spanish region, you get a very strong conflict between the encomiendas and the Jesuit missions. The encomiendas are basically set up so that the Spanish colonists are allocated a certain indigenous village or a leader and their followers for the course of 2 lives. They're not meant to have them forever. So their firstborn child can inherit them, but then they have to reapply to the state to get control of that indigenous group again. That's a way for the crown to limit the power of those colonists. And the system was very exploitative. Whereas the Jesuit mission system is separate from that and arose because of the Spanish crown and different Jesuit missionaries realizing that the indigenous population was crashing under the encomienda system, and they wanted to change the way that they exploited that labor to try and stabilize the population a bit. So they switched over to the Jesuit mission system. So then you have these clashes between the encomenderos, the Spanish colonists who had encomiendas, and the Jesuits over that indigenous labor. And you had Guaraní leaders allying with different groups or rejecting both systems entirely as a way of maintaining their own power.
All right, we still have a few more minutes if anyone wants to send in any additional questions. In the meantime, I have a couple lined up. So I suppose that as an amateur historian, I'm interested in how a professional historian like yourself approach the primary sources that informed your maps. So you mentioned a variety of archives from Asunción to Sao Paulo to Spain. You mentioned Guarani collaborators you worked with. So I guess my question is how did you go about identifying people or places that could help you construct your maps, and what challenges were involved in that process?
Yeah, that whole methodology of how you set it all up is a big part of what I've been thinking about, because of the complexity of looking at those different archives, as you say, and then also talking about that material with contemporary Guarani scholars and Guarani activists and writers who have their own interpretation of that material from their own worldview. So the process with the thesis has been that I started out meeting those different collaborators first, and then finding out more about the history as I went along, and from what I already knew just generally, and then reading more specifically, then finding out what were the main archives to have a look at, getting funding to go and have a look at those archives as part of the PhD, and then bringing that material into meetings and discussions with those collaborators to discuss that together, what they thought of that material as well. So yeah, the general process for finding the different archives was reading secondary sources, reading other people's history books, and then where they said they were, what resources they were using, text written specifically about those resources, and then visiting the archives as well to discover other material that hasn't been published and integrating that. So all those maps are based on all those primary documents and what they're saying as well. And then there's maps in there as well that look at those different perspectives of how you would look at that knowledge as well. There's my perspective, which is more focused on the politics and the commodity flows and all these kind of things. And then say someone like Timocho, when he looks at that history, he focuses on the names of the Yerbales and what the significance of those names in Guarani, of those environmental spaces, the connections between the Guarani people there and those spaces, and what that all would have meant, which is this other way of looking at this same information, which for me, his perspective is a decolonizing perspective. It brings this other worldview to look at that same historical process, which I don't have. But in dialogue with him, I can understand more of his perspective and then the work that we produce together down the track can show both the process of colonization and then the way that contemporary Guarani groups still see that land and seek to protect the surviving areas of the forest, and also continue their culture and cosmology in the ways that Andrew was describing in the previous talk as well.
Perfect, thanks. We have another question here. How did your interest in Paraguay begin?
It began, I think the first thing that happened was that I visited the ruins of the Jesuit missions in Argentina, and I drew pictures of the ruins. And then later on, I met Anita Ekman, the Brazilian artist who's involved in the project as well, and Timocho Popigua and Vera Alexandre. And I showed them this material and these drawings, and out of that conversation, we started discussing the history of the missions and their interpretation of that history as well, and the project grew from there. And I've always enjoyed maps.
All right, terrific. My final question is, what's behind the name of the Hummingbirds Atlas?
Oh yeah, good question. So the hummingbird in Guarani cosmology is a messenger between the divine world and the idea of divinity and sacred space is quite complicated, but basically between Nyanderu, the deity, this is in Umbia Guarani cosmology, and the hummingbird can move between Nyanderu and the world that we live in and communicate messages, particularly to children. And so the idea with the atlas was that the atlas is doing something similar to the hummingbird. The hummingbird moves between worlds and cross-pollinates different trees, different flowers. And then the atlas is cross-pollinating different areas of knowledge, Guarani cosmology, history, geography and cartography, and also draws on anthropology. So it's moving between these different worlds to create this atlas.
All right, well, with that, I think we are about out of time, but thank you, Freg, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you to our audience for your participation and questions, and I'll turn it over to Vanessa.
Wow, thank you, Freg, and thank you, Greg. This was really interesting. Freg, I'm just curious whether you have reimagined what would have happened if the Guarani hadn't resisted the colonizing efforts.
It would be a very different history, but I think one thing that would have happened is that if the resistance hadn't played out in the way that it did, then I think the western part of the rainforest would have been destroyed earlier. So the surviving rainforest, particularly in Misiones in Argentina, I don't think would be there. And I don't think the Guarani groups that exist today would have descendants, but they wouldn't be calling themselves Guarani. So I think that resistance has allowed the survival and the revival as well of that society and culture over time.
Wow, really interesting conversation. I want to thank everyone involved in these two conferences today. Thank you to our lovely audience for their comments and questions. So again, on behalf of the Paraguayan Student Association, I would like to thank both of you for your participation. And I would like to remind everybody that you can rewatch this session on the YouTube channel. I'm looking forward to seeing more faces tomorrow for the Itaipu Dam and the reassessment of its treaty conference. I've been asked questions about whether our conferences are going to be translated or not. We're currently working on that. We wanted initially to have the ability to have this with subtitles, but unfortunately with the university platform, because of security issues, we couldn't really connect that feature, but we're working on it. So any changes, we are surely going to keep you posted through our social media platforms. So thank you so much, and hope to see you again tomorrow, everyone. Bye.